Okay, no one knows this.
Okay, I heard some interesting technical questions about flight or invisibility. We could probably easily spend the rest of the time talking about that, but we're not going to, unfortunately.
Would we propel from our legs?
Oh my god, there's just so many questions.
From the center of us, are we like lifting ourselves and throwing ourselves like conical?
Do you want to do that?
Lifting myself?
Yeah.
I would not be opposed. I mean, if I can lift other things and then lift myself.
Okay, so yes, you can lift other things, yes.
Regarding to the flying ability, would it be like you get to also control the wind so that you go into the air, or like that kind of flying, or is it like?
So the question is, are you Superman or are you Storm from X-Men? I think you're Superman, just for simplicity's sake, because then you've got a whole bunch of.
Simpler version.
Okay. Go ahead.
No, this is about the invisibility thing. If you're going to be invisible, are you just, is it an illusion so that other people can't see, or are you actually bending light around yourself? Because if you're bending light around yourself, you're going to go blind, because you won't be able to see anything.
Then it's the other.
No.
Okay, no, okay, I keep saying last one, but it's last. You get the
Does
last
like
one.
air pressure affect us like the higher we get for flying? Are we gonna lose oxygen or are we okay?
If you go into space, you're gonna die. But if you're like an airplane, you go as high as an airplane and you're fine. No, I said last one. Really, we need to talk about geos and bashing people's heads in with geos. Yeah, Nathan chose a delightfully, subtly, confusingly violent and horrific story that we're going to be talking about. I had never read it before Monday. I was absolutely baffled by it, and then I was absolutely slightly less baffled on the next pass, and then slightly less baffled on the next pass. And by now, I think I actually really like this story, and I want to go out and buy a George Saunders collection. What I want to talk about, and this I think is the perfect text for a lesson on how do I have it? Where to begin when you're writing your analytical paper, where to begin when you're teasing. You've got this kind of, it's not impenetrable, but it's a difficult text. It goes from voice to voice, it moves from perspective to perspective, it breaks into French, German, you get multiple points of view, etc., and it just seems like a lot to take in. And so some people just naturally gravitate towards, they can easily find things that they want to talk about and argue, when certainly in my first and second and third and fourth and master's year and most of my PhD, I found myself quite overwhelmed. So I'm going to do the step-by-step that I usually go through. Obviously, this is just the beginning of your writing career. This is just one approach to it, but I think it's the best one, obviously. The most important thing to begin with in any piece of writing is something that interests you. So I tend to look for a particularly odd or striking passage, some phrasing, like an odd choice of verbs that just doesn't seem to belong, is a little bit jarring. Another thing you can do is like a cluster of images. So for example, this isn't the one I'm going to be looking at, but in Victory Lap, Allison, at several occasions, she'll break into French, right? So you just notice that in these 2 or 3 or 4 occasions, she's breaking into French. Begin to ask questions about it, okay? So I notice this happens a few times. Why is it happening? What's going on with it? The really important skill to get in your heads and to work on for the rest of not just your academic life, but just your intellectual life, your life of being a curious person, is try to avoid yes or no questions as much as possible. The problem with yes or no questions is that they lead the interpretation, right? When you're starting with a text, you don't know what it's about, but your brain thinks it does, because your brain always thinks that it's smarter than it is. So usually you'll start already just sort of automatically saying things like, Allison breaks into French a lot, which would be the premise. Is this because she's shallow? Well, now that you've got this question in your head, is this because she's shallow? Then the rest of your reading, the Allison character is going to have that kind of bias or prejudice. And yes, of course, you can overcome that bias or prejudice, but you've already started yourself down a particular lane and you've already kind of closed yourself off to the interpretive possibilities. So the best kind of questions that you should be asking, the best kind of research questions, are questions that you honestly don't know the answer to. It's an anxiety-inducing moment to have, say, a pile of data, depending on how big your paper is. But say you've got 3 or 4 pieces of a pattern, just to put them together and really ask questions that you don't think that you're gonna, like at this point, you need to go back to it and read it again and start coming up with some answers. So the best research questions look like this. Not, does Allison do that because that? When you're asking a question that begins does, that's probably a red flag. Why does she do this? Another instance that could be, I think you could write a strong paper about this. The kidnapper in certain places uses weirdly technical phrases. When he's trying to drag her into the van, he talks about his pre-mission matrix. Does anybody remember what his pre-mission matrix is?
Leaving the van door unlocked.
Leaving the van door unlocked, right? You don't need this word, pre-mission matrix, to talk about leave the van door unlocked. And it's also reminiscent of the way Kyle's father speaks, right? He's got those, that weird contraption about everybody has to say who's in the house at one time, or everything is very particular in terms of treats or responsibilities or something. So both of them have these very kind of, like overly technical ways of looking at the world. So it seems like Saunders is trying to draw some sort of connection between Kyle's absent father and the kidnapper. What's the deal with that? Is a really good question to begin with. Kyle and the kidnapper both have imaginary conversations with parental figures. So the kidnapper is going to be talking to his, at this point, deceased stepdad, Melvin. Kyle is going to be having conversations with his dad. Allison doesn't have any parental figures throughout the entire story until the very end. So there is some sort of relationship going on with these individuals and these mostly absent parental figures. This is my absolute favorite thesis question. This is still the one that I use in my own work when I'm trying to come up with, okay, I know that I like this cluster of images, but I don't quite get it. This happens here, here, and here. What's up with that? And then once you get the what's up with that, then you can start asking the follow-up questions. So for example, that slide or not. So I'll use a specific example. Any of the ones that I was talking about earlier, all of those I think could make for a good argumentative paper. The example I'm going to be using is, do you guys remember the daydream that Allison has when she is thinking about the dead deer and the hunter? So I'm going to be talking about that. If you've got it in front of you, great. If not, I've got it on the screen here. I downloaded it from the New Yorker, so my version is unpaginated, but it would be on about page 2 or 3, depending on your edition. So it begins. Sometimes, feeling happy like this, she imagined a baby deer trembling in the woods. "Where's your mama, little guy?" "I don't know," the deer said in the voice of Heather's little sister Becca. "Are you afraid?" she asked it. "Are you hungry? Do you want me to hold you?" "Okay," the deer said. Here came the hunter now, dragging the deer's mother by her antlers. Her guts were completely splayed. Geez, that was nice. She covered the baby's eyes and was like, "Don't you have anything better to do, dank hunter, than kill this baby's mom? You seem like a nice enough guy." "Is my mom killed?" the baby said in Becca's voice. No, she said. "This gentleman was just leaving." The hunter, captivated by her beauty, doffed his cap, and going down on one knee, said, "If I could will life back into this fawn, I would do so in hopes you might defer one tender kiss upon our elderly forehead." "Go," she said, "only for your task of penance, do not eat her. Lay her out in a field of clover with roses strewn about her, and bestow a choir to softly sing of her foul end." "Lay out who?" the baby deer said. "No one," she said. "Never mind. Stop asking so many questions." Okay, so this seems like an odd passage to me. This particularly struck me just because of all the weird stuff that was going on, but specifically, it didn't seem like it really needed to be in this story necessarily. It's not like if Saunders had chosen to omit this scene with the deer, that his readers would be clamoring like, yeah, okay, we get this, but where's the conversation with the imaginary baby deer? Right? It seems like something that's a little bit peripheral, but Saunders thinks that it's important enough to include it. So, some of the questions, the most obvious one, what's up with that? What's going on here? What ideas is it conveying? And this is the one that I think is the one that I would recommend that you start with, particularly if you're lost in a paper. What does this one episode, or what does this cluster of images have to do with the larger story? In what ways is it expressing or introducing themes that are going to become important? So there are a few, and unfortunately I'm going to have to lead you through this. We'll have time for more participation in a minute, but there's just an infinite number of directions that this could go. So some of the things that I came up with is this passage with the deer and its mother is the first instance we have in this story of violence. It introduces the theme of violence, and especially gendered violence, right? It's no coincidence that the hunter is a man and he's pulling this female deer by its antlers. So here came the hunter now, dragging the deer's mother by the antlers. Her guts were completely splayed. Does this remind you of anything? The guts completely splayed? Perhaps echoed in another passage?
Is this when the head gets crushed at the end of the geode?
Yeah, when Kyle crushes the kidnapper's head with the geode, and he says something about like he thinks that he's wearing a gore cap. He touches his head and it's all squishy. That's not out of nowhere. We saw this a number of pages earlier with the deer guts completely splayed. Allison, who is breaking into French throughout and is rejecting all of her imaginary suitors because they're so small town and parochial and they're not sophisticated and cosmopolitan like her. This is maybe not our first, but a very clear example of the way that for all that she thinks that she's sophisticated, for all she claims to know, her knowledge of the world is actually pretty spotty. She just doesn't know things as well as she thinks she does. There's a couple of errors here in her facts. When she's dragging the deer's mother by the antlers, when the hunter talked or doffed his cap, and he says, if I could wheel life back into this fawn. Just bonus questions. What are some of the mistakes she's making? Yeah.
If I remember correctly, female deer don't have antlers.
Female deer don't have antlers. I double-checked this online just to make sure this is absolutely true. Apparently there are some rare mutations where they can grow scraggly antlers, but essentially female deer don't have antlers. Allison just doesn't know that.
Baby deer's not a fawn.
A baby deer is not a fawn. And then the other one is kind of obvious. Toft isn't a word. Just the hunter toft is, that kind of seems like something that I've heard before. Just her very basic knowledge. We're going to see this again later. She doesn't know how to change oil in a car. She doesn't know how to make brownies. Right? She carries herself with an air of sophistication, but she's much more ignorant than she'll allow herself to believe. I wasn't exactly sure how to phrase this, but she relies on her charm, or she sort of sees her charm or her beauty or her natural charisma as sort of this armor against the world. She thinks that she can bring men, in this, like he's literally like on his knee, oh, what can I do for penance for this baby deer? And in her sort of small suburban life, that's actually how her life has kind of been. It does seem like the boys have been throwing themselves at her. She's kind of just relying on, if anybody's ever read A Streetcar Named Desire, she's relying on the kindness of strangers. She thinks that this will get her through the world. But even in this fantasy, it's completely ineffectual, right? The hunter goes down on one knee to apologize, and then he kind of ineffectually apologizes, and he's like, okay, I'll do penance. For my penance, I won't eat this deer, so it's dead for nothing, and some choir will sing over it, which is, okay, great. So now this deer is dead, and nothing's really happened, but this old hunter is so charmed by her. And she takes this as a victory. She's not at all conscious that nothing's really happened here. And I think most importantly, and sorry this one's at the bottom, I'll read it out for those of you in the back, she's learned to keep her mouth shut when she's confronted with the ugliness of life. So this is really important. Lay out who, the baby deer says. No one, she said. Never mind. Stop asking questions. Right? Her first impulse when this baby deer, whom she's fantasizing, all of this is in her head, when the baby deer asks about the ugliness of life, or when she would have to say something like, your mother's dead, she can't. For some reason she's learned, don't ask questions. It's just not an appropriate thing to do. This is going to be pretty major foreshadowing for what's going to happen very shortly. Does anybody remember what her reaction is when the kidnapper comes to her house dressed like a serviceman?
She opens the door, like she doesn't necessarily question it. And for this in class, actually, like you could like attribute that to maybe like once again your idea of gendered violence that she was raised to think to be courteous.
So she opens the door. She doesn't think any of it. Well, maybe not. Did you want to build on that?
Her first instinct is to shut the door, but she's like, that would be impolite, so she asks him what she can do to.
Yeah, absolutely. She senses danger with this guy, but presumably all her life, don't ask questions, don't talk about it. She says it would be impolite. She wants to run away from this guy, but her instinct or her training to please people, presumably to please men, sort of overrides any kind of self-preservation instinct, right? So in this short little, seemingly odd daydream about a deer in a story that's about a kidnapper and beating somebody, or not quite beating somebody to death with a rock, this odd interjection is sort of laying out the themes and also some of the obstacles she's either going to have to overcome or isn't going to overcome. And I don't want to say too much more about this. What I'm going to say is we have a premise here. And the premise that I've come up with is the daydream about the deer introduces themes of sexual violence and Allison's inability to confront the ugliness of life. So this is the end of paragraph 1. I've proudly written this, and then I hand it in, and then Nathan says, so what? There's nothing going on here. This is a kittens are cute argument. There's nothing really to push against. At this point, no person could reasonably deny that those themes are present. A very obtuse person could raise a very crappy argument against it, but basically those themes are present. I think that's pretty clear. So anything that would come after that, it would be correct, it would be safe, but it would also be kind of not boring, like the scenes you're talking about would be interesting, but it would be flat. There's no motivation. You're not working hard to prove it because it's really proven in the premise. So this one is going to be a list. So what I want you guys to do, I'm going to break you into groups now, and we're going to do this exercise. In small groups, discuss the deer daydream in relation to the rest of the story. Consider related passages which may or may not be relevant to what we've seen in the deer episode. For instance, there's lots of dreaming and daydreaming. So you could read this as one of many dreams and see if there's sort of a progression in dreams or some sort of pattern you can find in that. Other instances of violence, overt or a little bit more implicit. I promise you the kidnapper is not the only other violent male in this story. Other instances where Saunders foregrounds the voice, right? She tells the deer to be quiet, but this story is full of singing, shouting, not being able to shout, etc. You could look at, it would be perfectly reasonable to put on your midterm or final, discuss the voice in Victory Lap. There's lots of places you could look there. Or absolutely anything else. I've just given you a few places to look, but go crazy, use your imagination. So complete the following. You don't have to use the words because, therefore, in order to, but add a premise or add a significance to this. So the daydream about the deer introduces themes of sexual violence and Allison's inability to confront ugly realities of life. Finish that off with a because or a so what or in order to. What I'm going to do, I'm going to break you into 4 groups. So when I point at you, you're going to say 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. Good there? Perfect.
2.
Excellent.
1, 2,
3.
Okay, good news for you. Ones come over here. All of the ones comes over here. All of the twos will bring you over
Here?
here. I know. Number threes will come here, and number fours in the back corner. Okay? Ones, twos, threes, fours.
Yeah.